Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Ethical Skills for Leaders and the Unexpected Benefits for Organizations and Employees. Many of you are returning attendees at McKonly and Asbury's annual ethics webinar, so I welcome you back, and I'm glad you joined us for today's session. My name is Mike Hoffner. I'm managing partner at McKonly and Asbury, and joining me today is Janice Snyder, one of my partners and our Director of Assurance Services here at the firm. For those who may be joining us for the first time, McKonly and Asbury is an accounting and business advisory services firm with offices in Camp Hill, Lancaster, and Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, serving clients around the Mid-Atlantic region, providing a range of services to organizations throughout a variety of industries you can see on your screen. We do encourage you to visit our website to learn a little bit about more about who we are and who we serve. And if you've joined us in past webinars, we do welcome you back, but if you haven't, please be aware that our monthly webinar series features various business topics that'll keep you updated on things going on in the industry around us and things that you may be very interested in. So please be sure to check out our website to both see our past presentations that you can still take a look at, as well as finding out current information with things going on in our firm and in our communities. So finally, need to cover a few housekeeping items before we start our actual discussion on ethics for leaders. So first, if you have questions during today's presentation, we would invite you to submit those questions through the built-in questions function in your webinar control panel. We will absolutely do our best to answer those during or after the webinar and commit to you that if we don't get to them because of time, we will make sure we find a way to reach out and get you an answer. For those that are looking to obtain CPE credit for today's webinar, please keep in mind and be looking out for 3 polling questions throughout the presentation. You do need to answer all 3 questions, and once you do that and we complete the webinar, you will get your certificate via email a few weeks thereafter. So please keep an eye out for those pop-ups and answer those questions. We'll give you a little bit of time for that. But we want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to get the CPE that they're looking for, particularly because we know ethics is a pretty important thing when it comes to license renewal. So with that, Janice, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off on our content.
Great, thanks. As Mike said, my name is Janice Snyder. I'm a partner here at the firm. I wear 2 hats at the firm. I get to lead our assurance and advisory team, but I'm also the designated HR partner. So ethics certainly plays a tremendous role in both of those positions that I fill. But we're starting here today with the cost of unethical behavior. So we have some data points here, and the bottom line is the cost is high. Whether you're looking at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and their report, they did one in 2020. We have some updated information at the end from 2022, but it's costing most companies 5% of their revenue, whether you know that or not. Now that could be outright fraud, theft, stealing, or it could be lesser things with unethical behaviors and things that are permitted in the workplace. You can also see here that the FBI crime statistics that business email compromise, so people clicking on those links, all those scams, certainly those scams are not only unethical, they're also illegal, but as they target so many of our organizations, and they target your employees particularly, but it's costing US businesses over 1.8 billion, yes, that's billion with a B, dollars each year. But if you look at that first statistic as well, the median cost of a fraud from misappropriation of assets, so that's our auditor's fancy way of saying stealing, theft, any other thing you can take from your organization, is about $100,000 per case. So I don't know any organization out there that can afford to lose $100,000. I mean, that's just incredible. So hopefully we've used a little bit of this to get your attention, and hopefully you're here for a little more than the CPE. We've had some nice chats and questions coming in, so hopefully you actually are paying attention and being ethical as you listen to this webinar and earn your CPE this afternoon. I had to do a quick little throwback because last year Mike and I did our entire ethics webinar on Andrew Fastow, the CFO of Enron. So I think Enron really shaped a lot of my career and the ways I think about things, and I just can't seem to let it go. But I like Andrew's words. We're not going to focus on him again this year. But there are people who look at rules and find ways to structure around them. The more complex the rules, the more opportunities. And I certainly know in the accounting world, we can get all sorts of rules. And I think sometimes that's true. The more complex the rules, the more opportunities. And Enron was a classic example of that. So the reminder here is that it's not enough to just simply follow the rules. You have to be thinking through what's ethical, what's moral, what's right. And you see there that greed took over with Andrew Fastow and Enron, and they lost their moral compass. And they really weren't thinking through the ethics of all of the decisions that they were making and all of the lives that that impacted. So that's enough about Enron, as we've done entire webinars on that. But let's talk about what we're going to focus on today, as we've taken a moment to set the stage a little bit. So we're looking here at ethical organizations. So what is an ethical organization? How do we design them? What are some examples of an ethical company? And then we're going to move into ethical business practices, look a little at the AICPA Code of Conduct. Don't think we can get ethics CPE without at least touching on that a little bit. Business and accounting ethical considerations. And then unexpected, I'll call some of them unexpected. Maybe you haven't made that link between your ethical work environment and what that can cost your organization. But we'll save those specifics for later. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike and let him lead us into what is an ethical organization.
That's a heavy lift to talk about, Janice, because I think there's this idea and mentality that all organizations must be ethical, especially small businesses, right? We have this mindset that we have individuals who start organizations, they come from a good moral background, and so they're a good, strong, ethical person. Therefore, their organization clearly is what I might consider an ethical organization. And I want to be careful that we differentiate and distinguish between an ethical leader and an ethical organization. And I think it is inherently possible and probable that a very strong person of ethics in a leadership position may be overseeing an organization that you or I might look at and say is not what I would consider an ethical organization. And that's because they haven't done the things, they haven't implemented the policies, processes, they haven't talked about core values and culture in a way that really takes their personal ethical framework and pushes it down amongst the organization. So while it may sound like an obvious statement, I do think it's really important to start with that mindset that an organization run by an ethical leader is not automatically by nature an ethical organization. So we need to start by setting that foundation, that framework of what is an ethical organization before we can talk about the benefits thereof. And so there's some things here that again, as Janice said in the Andrew Fastow slide, there's some things that harken back to previous discussions we've had, and we've built over, I don't know, Janice, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years of doing ethics presentations, a variety of focus areas. And one of them years ago was this idea of the pillars of a strong ethical organization. And so we wanted to bring some of those ideas back and talk about how that ethical leader can be intentional about taking their personal ethics and moral framework and using that to build what I would consider or you would consider to be an ethical organization. So the pillars that came in, this comes out of a Harvard Business Review article on designing an ethical organization. And there's really 4 pillars that have been identified. The first, and I think to me, I would say the most critical and important, is to have explicit values, to be very clear on explaining to the people in the organization what the values of the leader and the organization are. So that could come in the form of really strong, well-defined core values. It could come in the form of a clear mission statement. It could be principles of how we do business. But at the end of the day, if we don't talk frequently, clearly, and regularly about what our value position is as a leader, our organization doesn't understand what our expectations are. Many of you have heard the adage that it takes at least 7 times of repetition for something to start to sink in. And so we really need to have those ethical framework, that the explicit values defined and communicated on a regular and frequent basis. And when I say regular and frequent, when somebody onboards, and then once a year when we go through maybe an organizational checkup, is not what I would consider regular and frequent. So we'll get a little bit into the why around the first point there in just a minute. The well-meaning people being ethically malleable. It's a very interesting thing to talk about. We could spend probably more time than we should on that. So keep that in mind. First pillar is to have those explicit values defined and communicated. Second is to make sure that organizationally, every decision that is made and every issue that is framed out is built around, the solutions are built around the idea of what is the right response? What is the ethical response? And so when we sit back and we think about judgment through scenarios and situations we may encounter in our organization, ensuring that not just the executive leaders, but leaders at all levels in the organization think ethics first. And when that framework is in place, it's a lot harder to accidentally make a bad decision when you step back and accidentally make a bad decision in terms of the right versus wrong from an ethical concept. If that's your first thought on every decision you're facing, is what is the right answer for my customers, for my people, and for my organization? If that's baked into every decision you make, it becomes very easy to say, yes, we make the right decisions. Incentives is a little bit harder to talk about. It's a pillar, clearly, because Janice put it on the slide. But when you talk about incentives for ethical behavior, I invite you to sit back and think about, how do you incentivize and reward somebody for simply doing the right thing and being ethical? And I would argue that that's hard to put a clear framework around. We talk about SMART goals, right? We achieve incentives because we've met our goals, and SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, all that stuff. Well, making ethical decisions and doing things the right way is hard to put that SMART box around. So I would invite you to think about that in your organization. How do you incentivize people doing the right thing? Another aspect of that I would absolutely invite you to consider, and how you frame out an ethical organization, is how you allow people to participate in your incentive programs. And what I mean by that is it's very easy for somebody to be incentivized based on wonderful economic performance, high sales, great profitability, getting the next big client landed. Are we willing to tell the person who just landed that massive contract that they aren't participating in an incentive program because the way they did it was out of alignment with our core values? So there's an aspect of incentivizing people that may actually be a little bit more, I would consider it more of a negative, right? A disincentive. But you have to be willing to in essence punish the high performer if that high performance comes out of poor ethical decisions. And then finally, cultural norms. Is it known throughout your organization that doing the right thing is simply what we do? And it's not a question. Nobody looks with raised eyebrows when somebody does the right thing and says, wow, that's impressive. When somebody does the right thing, we look at it and say, yeah, that's who we are. That's not something that stands out as a unique. Is it a cultural norm within our organization? So things to think about as you're trying to define what is my organizational framework and what I consider it an ethical organization. So a couple other things that came out of a more recent article in the Harvard Business Review really are the idea, again, of building an ethical company. And this idea I mentioned on the last slide about people being malleable in their ethical framework. And I love that first quote on your screen right now. People don't enter the workforce with a fixed moral character. It will change. Not that it can change, but it will change. And I would invite you all who are listening in today to think about the moral framework with which you made decisions as a teenager. And I know that's very different from being an adult, but some of you are thinking and you have a grin on your face because you know you did the right thing because you had a high moral standard and it was really precise. And others of you are grinning because you think, I wouldn't do the things today that I would have done as a teenager. And as as people grow into adulthood and enter the workforce, and you think about your entry-level individuals joining your organization, or even seasoned employees, they come from a background that you don't know and you're not aware of. So somebody comes in at a particular point on their moral and ethical journey. And they come in particularly thinking, absolutely, you're hiring them because you think they're going to do the right thing. But if we don't nurture that in our organizational culture and through our training and through our incentives and through how we talk about things, and we exhibit that through the decision making done at leadership, it's very easy for that moral compass to sway. So we have to build the framework for our teams. We have to build the framework for them to think in a positive aspect and to grow forward into what we would consider, I would just use the phrase, a stronger ethical foundation. So it's really about, how do I think through things, and can I impress upon somebody how they should think through decisions that are being made in our organization? Because I don't know where they came from, and I don't know where they are at the point, their current point in life. The second quote, ethical learning is a lifelong process, and it doesn't apply to rote. I know we bolded the first part of that. That kind of ties into the your framework changes over time, but it's really that second statement that I want to reference. It doesn't happen by rote. It's not a do this, don't do that. We can't build an ethical organization by providing a decision tree that says, if you're faced with this issue, this is what you do. And we'll talk in just a few minutes about, Janice mentioned the AICPA's Code of Ethical Conduct. Years ago, the Code of Conduct was built around much more what I would consider a rules-based framework. It was do this when you're in this situation. And the way we had to approach things back then was, well, let me go find the closest scenario to what I'm facing. Never, or extremely rarely, was it an exact match to an issue that was identified. And the AICPA realized that we can't define ethics by a decision tree. It's not a here's your situation, here's what you should do. And so a number of years ago, they moved into much more of a framework for decision making as opposed to a rules-based. And I would invite you to think about that in your organization. You can't tell your employees, you can't tell your leadership team, when you face this situation, this is what you do, because they will never face exactly the situation that you lay out on paper. So we need to provide a framework around which our folks can really develop that lifelong ability to make the right decision and to shy away from the wrong decision. And I'm not going to touch on the last quote because we're going to get into that at the end of our discussion today, this idea of why is it attractive to be an ethical organization. So we'll come back to that one, but I'm sure in all my rambling here, you've all had time to read that particular quote. So we're going to go ahead and move to the next spot. And Janice, I think it's over to you to dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, you're right, Mike. We're going to spend a lot of time about the benefits of being an ethical organization. So, but let's move on to this one to talk a little bit about how work plays a huge role in people's lives. So Mike mentioned on the last slide that we have a lifelong learning process in ethics, and employees can learn to be more or less ethical over time. So I would wonder, is your organization fostering that ethical environment every day and in every decision and in every step that they take? Then I look to the second point here, work and life are more tightly intertwined than ever before. So I know many of us work from home or still do, or we're now working hybrid, or maybe if you're in the Northeast, like some of us, there's ice outside and this gave you another opportunity to be at home today. Maybe that's your usual. Virtual meetings are happening all the time. You know, I've loved, seeing people's cats and dogs and occasionally a new baby. But those lines are blurred. And so you're spending more time in most days with people from work than you are with your own family, like at least time that you're awake on any given day. So those individuals you're spending time with are actually shaping you as a person. And are you becoming a better person, a more ethical person over time, or is your organization not really fostering that? I would hope everyone on this webinar, it has the privilege of working for an organization that fosters an ethical working environment, always has room to improve, but that you can feel good every day that you know you've made the best ethical decision possible, that you're being supported in the workplace in making those decisions. And the last thing here, we're more likely to face ethical situations at work than we might anywhere else or in any other aspects of our lives. And some of that's the time that we spend at work, the relationships we have with those that we work with, and just the number of decisions. I certainly make a lot of decisions at home, but I make more at work, right? So we're making them all the time, and are we really thinking through what we're conveying and how we're portraying an ethical organization? So how can employers help their employees use the workplace as a laboratory for character development, and why should they? So we're definitely going to focus on a lot of those benefits, but we want ethics to be top of mind. We want to reward ethical behavior. And I think that's not always easy. When somebody comes to you with something challenging or something they've observed or something that they weren't comfortable with in the first place, are you going, wow, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Now I have the knowledge. I mean, that should be every employer's reaction. But sometimes we got things going on in our head that we're like, oh no, another problem. But we need to pause and stop and think about the ethics of that and say, this is great. I'm being made aware of what's happening in my organization. And we need to hold one another to those high ethical standards. So I'm going to move on to certain trends that are happening, the state of ethics and compliance in the workplace. So a great study, I can highly recommend that. I have a lot of fun staying up to speed on a lot of these things. You'll see lots of sources throughout this presentation. I love reading these reports every year. But I look at these, we have 5 trends here that came out of this study. And if you look at the quote there to the right, the workplace is a pressure cooker right now for employees in the US. We've had so much change in the last 2 years. So many things are exacerbated by every day. Am I at home? Is it hybrid? Am I in the office? What's the rules today? You can go back not too far. Is it a mask? Is it not a mask? What makes sense? Is that trending back at these moments? But situations are tenuous. And as you even think about all of those changes and all those things that happen, we have increasing rates of misconduct and very high rates of retaliation. So this study is concluding there may be a breaking point. And is that breaking point coming? And you need to think about your organization and say, are we ready? Do we have the right ethical environment for that? So when you look at these trends, I know you're all diligently reading them as everyone pays attention and focuses on their ethics webinar. But 2 of these trends are actually real positive. So trend number 1, ethical culture strength remains high. So this is good news. 1 in 5 employees were in workplaces that they say were a strong ethical culture compared to only 1 in 10. So we have evolved in the last 20 years. So this is a very good thing. I would love to see all, but we'll probably never get above 4 out of 5 that have a strong ethical culture. And the other positive trend is trend number 4. And I certainly think it's positive. Hopefully you do too, but more employees are reporting misconduct. So these are coming forward. They're feeling comfortable doing that. I do find the number incredibly high. 80%, 8 in 10 employees are reporting misconduct. So they are coming forward. They must trust someone in the organization to be able to do that. And I think they're the 2 positive things in this. But you can also look here, the other 3 trends are not so positive. These are more negative trends. Trend number 2, the pressure to compromise standards, it's the highest it's ever been. And so you look at that pressure that employees experience 2 times more pressure in 2020. All the change, all the disruption. You can also look at trend number 3, observed misconduct. So the misconduct is increasing. And one of the things they cited rising in their study was favoritism as one of the types of misconduct in the workplace. Management lying to employees, you'll lose a lot of trust there, and conflicts of interest. So things to keep in mind, but the last one that is pretty sad is the retaliation rates of individuals who are coming forward. They're experiencing much more retaliation, and that is being reported through these studies. So it's hard to do the right thing, and those employees that are coming forward and are reporting that misconduct, we should be thanking them as opposed to retaliating against them and making the right ethical decisions there. So this leads us right into our first polling question. So pay attention here, you got to answer 3 of these. So which trend is the most surprising to you? So I just touched on these 5 trends. So the first and the 4th one are more positive trends. But the second, third, and fifth one are negative trends and things we should be concerned about. So, Mike, what's the most surprising to you?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Of course. What else are you going to do while everybody's diligently answering this question?
And honestly, the one that's probably more surprising to me is that observed misconduct is increasing, and the reason that one stands out to me is because, as you mentioned earlier, we're in a remote environment where a lot of folks are, I would almost say, off the radar. They're getting their jobs done, and so what we see is work comes through.
10 more seconds.
10 seconds.
Get that answer in.
So we don't always step back, and so to say that observed misconduct is inching upwards, when I would think, well, there's more things that you can get away with in a virtual environment, right? So that's my answer, Janice. And clearly people don't agree with me, though.
Well, I mean, that's tied for second. So yeah, I think it's sad. As I said, the retaliation rate's skyrocketing. So that is the most surprising to a lot of people on this call. But your answer, Mike, was tied with compromising standards as the highest ever. I mean, unfortunately, I've seen, well, you know, a lot of frauds and issues. You do enough audits over the years of hundreds of companies. Most of them, the vast majority, I'd say 99%, are excellent at what we see, but I am seeing more organizations coming across, whether it's an expense reporting fraud or a payables fraud, or organizations that are taking advantage, or inventory theft, or computer theft, things like that. I've even seen fuel theft and people using company credit cards to go shop at Costco. I've seen many, many things over the years, but unfortunately, I'm seeing more of that. The phishing, the hacking, the wire transfers, as more and more things are automated through the pandemic. It's just hard to make sure that all of those things are not only in place in your organization, most organizations have them in place, but that the reviews, the controls, and the checks and balances are actually happening on a consistent basis. Because that one time you slip up, whether it's an inappropriate employee or it's an outside party attacking your organization, things can go bad quickly. All right, well, thanks everyone for answering that CPE question. And we're going to move on, and I'm going to turn it back to Mike to talk a good bit about ethical business practices. And Mike, your favorite, the Code of Conduct.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as Janice said, you can't do an ethics webinar for ethics CPE without talking about the Code of Conduct. So we're going to make it real easy on you. This is going to be a quick slide. But I did mention earlier, the Code of Conduct changed a number of years ago and moved away from this idea, again, of rules-based and situations of here's the situation, here's what you do, into a conceptual framework. And so now there are examples given because there are some really specific things that you need to think about. But it's really moved into this idea of how do you think about situations, and they've been very clear about tone at the top, and tone at the top being defined as how leadership emphasizes a commitment to the right things. So I think it's important to look at the Code of Conduct here, but I wanted to fold in, and we don't have this on the slide, I wanted to fold in how the AICPA's quality control standards for accounting firms defines this idea of tone at the top. And I think it's important because they use slightly different words. And instead of saying tone at the top, the quality control standards refer to this as leadership's responsibilities for quality within a firm. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about it, because tone at the top says, do I do the right thing so my people see me do the right thing? Right? And so I can say the right things, but I always make the right decisions, and so I'm setting the right tone. But the quality control standard idea of leadership's responsibilities for quality doesn't just say, am I doing the right thing? It says, am I taking an active interest in making sure my entire organization's doing the right thing? So I'd invite you to think about tone at the top that way. And similarly, we go to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners definition, which says tone at the top refers to the ethical atmosphere created in the workplace by the organization's leadership. And then that second piece, whatever tone management sets will have a trickle-down effect. So the AICPA, the ACFE, the mindset is similar, in that what we do is important and the image we set as leaders is important. But more important is to think about how that filters down through the organization and the responsibilities that you all have for the ethical framework of your organization. So I'll repeat what I said to tee things up earlier today. Organizations run by ethical people are not automatically ethical organizations. You have to consider your responsibility for pushing that mindset down through the organization. So there you go. There's our two definitional slides that talk about the code of conduct. And now we can move back into the more interesting things and still get our credit. So
there's still tone at the top on this slide though, Mike. So we still have tone at the top here. So you're not
we
getting
do have tone at the top. Tone at the top, and I'm sure we'll say it 3 or 4 more times while we're here today, but we want to just take a minute in our discussion today and talk about some general things for consideration. And there's a lot on the slide, and I invite you as we're chatting, and I'll certainly invite Janice to weigh in as well, to read through those things and think about from a general ethical considerations perspective, what is your organization doing in each of these areas? And it's important to have all, of course. If you go through these lists, both from an accounting perspective and from a just general organizational perspective, and you say, well, I feel like we're really good on 8 out of 10 or whatever your numbers are, and I apologize, I didn't count them in advance. I would invite you to really step back and think about the impact of one negative area on the overall framework of your organization. And I say that because I think it's very easy for our teams, and remember, we're talking about leaders and how we create an ethical framework in our organization as leaders. It's easy for teams to look at leaders and say, there was this one time, and this one time might have been 3 years ago, or there's this one thing that I think our organization does that I don't really feel good about, and all the other things you might do, and all the other things you might have built to what you think is a wonderfully ethical framework in your organization are very quickly corrupted by the one thing that you've not paid attention to. So I invite you to think about all the items on here and don't be satisfied with a 90%. Be satisfied with working towards 100%. We're not going to be perfect, but we do need to consider this. So Janice, are there any in particular on the slide that you wanted to talk about? Because I know you have a few favorites.
I do. There's 2 things I'll point out here. One is employee onboarding and orientation. So that's the first day. It's so critical. It's your first impression, but it's way more than just the first day. It's how are you following that through? How are you reinforcing that message? And as you said earlier, Mike, 1 day orientation, that's not going to cut it to set the culture and the tone at the top of your organization. The other one I want to touch base on, we also got a question on, which is about seeing the needs for clients do they need to update or improve their whistleblower policies, or are they generally adequate? Before I answer that, the first thing I want to say is if you look at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, their global studies, they are coming through that 42% of all the fraud cases they're being detected by individuals reporting them. So tips are coming in. Whistleblower policies and hotlines and ways to do that are one of the most prevalent ways that they get brought forward. So 1, that's incredibly important. But 2, where I see a lot of organizations fail on that is people don't know that there is a hotline, or it's not communicated well, or they can't say, oh, this is the number I would call. But if all those things are in place, the number is prevalent on the top of your intranet, it's on all your boards, it's there when you log into your computer, whatever it needs to be. But then who's monitoring those calls and the information that comes in, and who's following through on that? The monitoring and the follow through, I think, is one of the toughest things, because a lot of organizations, we ask organizations this through the audit process, they're never getting a call. And then I'm like, is that because people don't know about it? Is that because the number's not widely published? Or is nobody checking that voicemail or that line? So is there anything you would add on that, Mike, specifically to the question should clients be updating or improving their whistleblower policies?
No, I agree 100% with what you said, and that's where my response would have been as well. I think the issue we see is those that have whistleblower processes in place it's not necessarily the policy that needs updated. We're seeing far more often that it's the attention to the policy or the process, and the fact that the organization's just gotten stale over years. And so I think that answers the question. It's not a change to policies per se. It's a refresh of how we're communicating and following up on the things we're seeing.
I'm going to tie that into on the right there. The accounting ethical consideration is the monitoring of those controls. So you may have a good policy, you may have a great hotline, but who's checking it? What's the follow-up? And where's the accountability? Because a lot of the frauds that I've seen, and the more recent ones through the pandemic, is organizations have good controls in place, they have good processes in place, but somebody didn't check it, didn't approve it, didn't sign off on it, and the process didn't happen as it was intended, and no one was monitoring that process to make sure it was happening. They're the things that I think are falling through the cracks. Are we good with this slide, Mike? I'm good. All right. So these are just a few examples that I want to touch base on these ethical business practices. So Mike already teed most of this up, but I'll start with off to the right, that we have to be empowering our people and our employees to be doing good things. It's not just enough to avoid doing bad things. So how are we setting that example? And a couple of the things to talk about here, I'm not going to go through each one, but know your employees. How do they work? You know, how are they making decisions? I know there are times that I come to a conclusion quickly, or I decide something and I go, oh, I've got to back up and help fill in the blanks so people understand how and why I made that decision. And that how and why with your employees can be so important, but also understanding how they're making decisions. And is that the decision-making process you want them to be going through? And is that what your organization as a whole would support, particularly when you think about it from an ethics standpoint? I've got to put segregate duties over there. Accountants love this one. And the only thing I say about that is we all know we should segregate duties. The person putting people into the AP system shouldn't be the one processing payments, right? The people who are receiving cash shouldn't be the ones dispersing cash. There's a lot of accounting controls there, but there are other controls throughout the organization as well. And sometimes, I mean, I get involved in nonprofits and other organizations, and I want to segregate duties, and I get the eye rolls, or, you know, you're in a church or something, and you're challenging the way people have done something for years. But it's a good reminder that those controls and those checks and balances are our friends, and they're there to protect you, they're there to protect the organization, and they're there to protect other employees. So being ethical, doing right things, segregating those duties, even though it might take a little more time or be a little more challenging, it really is one of those cases where it's the right thing to do. Strong core values. Mike could talk about this all day. Mike loves to talk about our core values, but they're so important to setting that tone, but communicating that, reiterating that, what is important to your organization day in and day out. And we've touched base on this several times of rewarding ethical behavior. So, you know, thanking individuals for bringing things to your attention, for pointing things out, for finding ways the organization can be better, for finding ways the organization can consistently be doing the right and ethical thing. And through all of those things, be a good role model. So do any of those stand out to you, Mike?
Well, I think you already stole my thunder on core values. The only thing I would add around that, because you're right, I could talk about core values all day, is core values as defined are really important for an organization to have. But I would also offer that there are things that maybe don't make the core value list because they're so obvious. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of organizations that don't have, I'll use the word integrity or honesty in their core values, and we're one of those. McKonly Asbury used to have integrity defined as a core value, and we stepped back and said, that's just table stakes, that's entry level. If you don't have integrity, you can't be here. So it's no longer in our stated core values. But I think it's important to make sure all of our people still know that is a obvious and necessary thing, that is a character trait that has to exist. So as you think about core values, a lot of organizations have defined those 3 or 4 or 5 core values that are on the wall. but make sure you're talking about those things that you look at and say, well, it's not on our core value list because, well, it's just obvious. Make sure we think about and talk about those things as well.
Great, thanks, Mike. All right, so this is the last slide before your next polling question. So there's your heads up. But unethical business practices. So things that are ethical violations. And I'm not going to read this whole list, but some of these are more subtle than others. And I know that Mike and I read lots of articles, lots of studies, and had a lot of fun discussions preparing for this webinar. But you look at different ways, you know, obviously discrimination in the workplace in many different ways is absolutely wrong, if not illegal. But there are more subtle ways of, do you discriminate when you're quoting different clients for pricing or for services or things of that nature. But I also looked at it, spreading rumors about coworkers. Like, that is definitely unethical business practices. And, you know, we might have referred to that as water cooler talk pre-pandemic. You know, are you saying positive things? Do you know what you're saying is true? Or are you truly just spreading those rumors? But the one that jumped out to me is not providing exact updates to the supervisor. Like, I often wonder, if you know something's due on Friday and you find out at noon on Friday, like, this big deadline is going to be missed. I'm like, we definitely knew that before noon on Friday. You probably were really sure on Wednesday. So it can get a little gray, but what type of those behaviors are you promoting, and which ones are you rewarding? Are you rewarding the person that lets you know 2 days ahead of time and we can pivot and find a way to catch up or get that work done or set better expectations? So some of these are more overt or even clearly, if not illegal. And some of them, you know, like asking candidates whether they have children, there's all sorts of things you cannot legally ask a candidate. But some of them are a little more subtle. Did I provide an exact and honest and clear update to where I am with my work and my responsibilities? So just something to think about as we move on to the next polling question. I can take one step to improve my organization's already amazing ethical business practices. I will take this one step. So
I appreciate that we're assuming that all of our attendees do believe that their organization has an amazing ethical business culture. I believe that's the case. So I do like how you asked that.
But we can always improve, right? And that's why a lot of us are here today. Not just to get CPE, but hopefully to improve our businesses and improve our ethical.
I'm certain, Janice, that nobody's here just for the CPE.
I don't know. We'll find out with the last polling question.
we can argue later whether they're here for you or for me, but I'm going to go with that approach.
All right. I don't know how many more seconds do we have? That's it. We have maybe 20 more seconds, so take a few minutes. Make sure you answer that. So I like all of these, so I don't know which step I would want to improve, but Mike, you can always have a good core value discussion.
Well, you know where I'm going to end up, Janice, and I look at our organization and really the idea of what the Entrepreneurial Operating System, EOS, has done for a lot of organizations that have implemented it, identifying core values that really clarify the identity of the organization, I think is a huge contributor to ethical culture. So that's always where I'm going to end up.
That's great. I would also say, Mike, we already have amazing core values. So I like.
I think that's probably why this is the lowest ranked.
Yeah. I think the organizations on this call are already probably fantastic at that. So I like to be a good role model for my team and emulate those ethical behaviors and make sure that all the decisions are making demonstrate that every day.
Yep.
All right, Mike, the fun part, the pinnacle of the webinar.
That's right. And as we start to land the plane here over the next 10 to 15 minutes of conversation, we are going to talk about some unexpected benefits of an ethical culture. As we get into this, I would invite you and remind you again that you can pose questions. We appreciate those that already have, and just go ahead and type those into the chat box, and we will strive to answer them at the end. But let's talk a little bit about unexpected benefits of having an ethical culture. And I would wager that as you look at these next two slides, your reaction might be something along the lines of, oh yeah, that makes sense. But let's think about each of them and talk about what it might mean in terms of the long-term success of the organization that you're a leader in. So first and probably most obvious is asset protection, right? So when you have built and designed a strong culture of ethics and a strong foundational moral compass in the organization, I think it is fairly natural to think that you're hiring and retaining the kind of people that will make sure that your assets are taken care of. So we go a little bit beyond the idea of someone's going to steal my stuff, right? It's not just about that. And Janice mentioned earlier that misappropriation of assets, huge issue regarding fraud. But when we talk about the unexpected benefits around asset protection, it's not just that your stuff won't get stolen. More importantly, it's that you've developed a culture where people want to safeguard what they've been given ownership of. So they take better care of the equipment in the shop. They take better care of making sure that the IT resources are well handled. They just take better caution around protecting what you've given them. So I want you to think beyond just that idea of things walking out the door. That's the obvious unexpected benefit, or that I guess would be an expected benefit. Productivity and teamwork, and of course, as we're accountants, we like the idea of increased revenue. When you have a culture that is heavily focused on a unified ethical framework, people are aligned. And when people are aligned and engaged in what they're doing and in how they're serving the marketplace, whether you are a public accounting firm, a manufacturer, in healthcare, or a governmental entity, when you are aligned in how you go about business, the productivity will increase. And you know, we probably could have found a bunch of stats from the Harvard Business Review and other sources around that. I'm kind of a guy that goes on the gut, and I believe it's a fairly obvious assertion to say when everybody's aligned and rowing the same direction and trust the people around them, productivity will increase because the teamwork will be second to none. Janice, anything on that before we keep going?
I mean, there's a lot we could say about that, but just, I mean, when you streamline decision making and you know that everyone's going to be on the same page, it just makes everything go so much smoother. I mean, of course, productivity is going to go up.
Yeah, I thought you might have a statistic, but I was wrong.
I think we do in the back, but we'll get to that. That's the last.
All right, fair enough. Attracting and retaining outstanding employees. We are, I believe it's a fairly obvious thing to say, we are in an environment that we've never experienced before in terms of what I'll call the war for talent. Trying to find good, strong, solid individuals to work in an organization is very difficult right now. The available labor pool has shrunk. The number of jobs has increased. Unemployment is extraordinarily low. So how do you win the war for talent? You have two options. You either just pay more than everyone else, and that is a really, really dangerous downward cycle, particularly if you are not a good organization and not a healthy organization. That is going to foster worse culture. Or you can create an environment that attracts the best of the best. And yes, you absolutely need to pay market, but you create an environment that attracts and retains the best of the best by having that culture that draws people to it. If you have a culture that folks from the outside can see the engagement of your team, the decisions that are made are all proper and appropriate, and they feel good about it. They see how your organization sells in the marketplace against your competition, and you do it in a way that is positive and builds up your organization, not tears down the other organization. All those things that are foundational in a high ethics organization make you a very desirable employer. And quite honestly, that's how you win the war for talent. And so it's really important, and now more than ever, to think that way. Similarly with job satisfaction, Retention is obviously, in my view, every bit or more important than attraction of new employees. Retaining the great folks you already have on your team is second to none. And when you have in an organization a culture that makes people feel respected and engaged, they feel like they're aligned with the person sitting next to them, they feel like they're aligned with leadership, the likelihood of a departure is far lower. And so if you can attract the best of the best and retain the great people you already have, clearly sort of an obvious lean towards why creating an attractive ethical culture is important in your business.
Yes, Mike, I work with mostly manufacturing and healthcare organizations, and all of them have employee concerns and need to attract and retain their people. And if they can get that job satisfaction as well, that's certainly a win.
So the next slide, a few more things that, again, nothing that is what I believe is earth-shattering, but things to think about. So public reputation. There are statistics, and I didn't pull them together for this, but there are statistics that high ethics organizations and organizations that are viewed as having a really high, I'll call it moral compass, do have a stronger return on equity. They do have a stronger market share. They tend to have a higher market cap. But you just earn a tremendous amount of respect when people look at your organization and know that the employees in your team that have your logo on their business card are just going to be the kind of people that do the right thing and make the right decisions. Public reputation, obviously, we often think about the negatives. We think about the Enrons. We think of, there's a whole variety of them over the last 2 decades where a poor ethical culture makes the news, and we think about that. But there is a strong sense of looking at an organization and knowing that they make the right choices that makes you want to work with them. So obviously public reputation is important. Trouble-free work environment. Janice, you're our HR partner. I think we have a great trouble-free work environment here, but I know you see some things outside of our walls that maybe you want to comment on here.
It's always better to have the trouble-free work environment. You have less legal issues, you have less contention between employees, you have less concerns on a day-to-day basis. You don't want to know if you have to call in on your insurance or anything like that. If you have that ethical work environment, it does certainly help and lessen all of those issues with your employees. So could say
decision making and trust and transparency. I do think they're tied together. Decision making in a framework of ethics creates an environment of trust within the organization. So we can talk about accountability and transparency all we want. At the end of the day, I lean towards the idea that last bullet point, as Janice and I were talking about these unexpected benefits, is the one that to me is the most significant for an organization's health, and that's that trust within the organization of your coworkers and your leadership. So creating that culture of high ethics and living day in and day out from a leadership perspective, making the right decisions, supporting people who make the right decisions, even if that might not be the most economically successful decision. That creates a level of trust in an organization that when things aren't great, and we are entering a recession or we're in a recessionary period, the question is how deep and how long will the recession go? But we are entering in a period where there are going to be challenging decisions that have to be made by leadership no matter what industry you're in. And if you fostered an environment and a culture of high trust, because people know that you make the right decisions in the context of thinking about ethics first, you think about doing the right thing first, they know that your decisions are going to be sound and appropriate, that degree of trust entering a time period when you might need to make some difficult decisions will be more significant than I think we appreciate. So creating that culture in advance of tough decisions is how those tough decisions are accepted and believed in by the team around you. So things that I would invite you to think about. Janice, anything to add?
No, I think you hit these 8 unexpected benefits, so I'm going to move us into the last slide with some of the data. The main thing to highlight here is the quote up in the right. So this is the report to the nations from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They updated it for 2022. But their conclusion in their quote is that creating an ethical work environment is the most beneficial step an organization can take to prevent these. So when you look, what are these? 5% of revenue loss due to fraud. That's just astounding and not something any of our organizations can support. You see there, I mentioned this earlier, 42% of frauds were detected by tips. So those whistleblower hotlines, those monitoring, that culture where individuals are willing to come forward, and that ethical environment is so important. You see the theft statistics there in the middle towards the bottom, the misappropriation of assets. So what's being stolen with a median loss of $100,000? It's just astounding. And I certainly can say I've seen more in the last 2 years. But when you look at the occupational frauds and who is committing them, I mean, I look at, you see operations there. So I've definitely seen inventory theft, fixed asset theft, computers, phones, things like that. Accounting theft, the wires, the payables, the phishing, sending money out when you shouldn't. Executive and upper management, I see that with Enron, but there's also some more local examples we could cite there, but I won't. And then on the sales team, I think I've really seen a lot of either expense reporting or trying to inflate sales or kickbacks that could be occurring through that process. So the message is it is happening, and your ethical work environment is the best way to prevent that. So if you have anything to add, Mike, I'm going to move us to the last polling question. But
move us to the last polling question.
There we go.
We'll go ahead and read it, and then we can answer a couple other questions that came in.
Well, I just want to hear what the most beneficial aspects are, and I know some of you just need the CPE, so hopefully you'll be honest, but hey, you're ahead of the game if that's why you're here, and hopefully we gave you a little bit of valuable information in the process. But go ahead, Mike, I think you might answer some of the questions.
So, yeah, we had a couple questions come in. One is a fairly easy answer from my perspective, and that first question is, tech companies are terminating thousands of employees with the fear of recession coming. Do we still think the labor market is hard and it's difficult to find employees? And I would offer that if you're a tech company who has fully remote needs, you'll have no problem finding people given that statistic. If you are a manufacturing entity that needs people on the floor
10
to
more
run,
seconds, so make sure you answer that question.
Get your answers in. So I think the question is the answer is yes, I think the labor market will remain difficult for many industries because folks who are working in tech will not necessarily translate quickly or easily into the kinds of jobs that are also in need. So Janice, you want to go ahead and close out the poll, and then we can talk about the second question that came in.
We closed out the poll, Mike, and people most appreciate the dialogue and the discussion. So, and there are some of you who are just ahead on your CPE, but I can't believe that's the lowest percentage. So.
So the other question that came in, and then we're going to close things out here as we're nudging just up against 3 o'clock, is I had made a comment in the discussion a little bit earlier about dropping the word integrity out of our core values because it was table stakes, and how do our new core values support an ethical culture? Truthfully, that's probably another 45-minute discussion because I would love to have that and really dig into how we talk about core values here at the firm. And what I will say is this, one of our core values is we, not me, and it's really around doing the right thing for everybody around you. And so there's a little bit of that ethics component to that if an individual does the wrong thing, whether it's to benefit themselves or for some other reason, that individual is not living out a we, not me type of attitude. We also are very clear that, well, it's table stakes. What that means is if there is somebody who is not behaving in an ethical or in high integrity fashion, it doesn't need to be in a core value for that individual to be terminated. We do hire and terminate around our core values, but if somebody is a low ethics person, I hope we didn't hire them in the first place. but they won't last in our organization. So I'm not going to ramble on. I could talk for 30, 40 minutes about our core values and how we think they impact how we do things. Would love whoever particularly asked that question. My contact info is on the screen. Be fun to catch up over coffee and talk about that a little bit more. With that, go ahead, Janice.
We have a few other questions, but we're not going to get to them. But if you want to reach out to us personally, these are some interesting questions. We'd love to address them, but we want to make sure we finish on time. So you ready for your last slide, Mike?
I am ready. So we're going to close things out here. And in all seriousness, thank you so much for joining us. We had great attendance today, and Janice and I have enjoyed the conversation and hope you did as well. As Janice said, if you have further questions on anything we went through, please feel free to reach out. Our contact information was included there. A recording of our presentation will be available on our website and through our social media sites in a few days. For those who requested CPE and answered the polling questions, you'll see your certificates in the next few weeks. A few of you reached out and noted that you had some issues with technology on the polling questions. Those will be addressed. So thank you for reaching out on that. So finally, I would just invite you to save the date for our upcoming January webinars. On the 11th, our partner Dale Carnegie Mid-Atlantic is going to focus on self-awareness, leading with emotional intelligence. And on January 26th, David Blaine, our partner and director of entrepreneurial services, along with Eric Blocker, our principal and director of business valuation services, will focus on the what, when, and why of quality of earnings. Should be some really interesting sessions there, so please mark your calendar. Make sure to check out our website and register for those events as they're coming up. So with that, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you.